Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. If you are new here, I am UV. In this video, I'm going to give you a detailed comparison between two of the beautiful Australian cities of Sydney and Perth. This was a highly requested video after my last video where I discussed about the pros and cons in Perth. So, if you are someone who's planning a move or visit to Australia and just thinking about which of the cities would work best for you, this is the right place. So without further ado, let's get into the video. So number one, and probably the biggest difference, is the real estate market. Sydney is significantly more expensive than Perth, both for renting and buying. If you compare the median prices in 2024 of the two cities, Sydney's median price is almost double compared to Perth, which is close to $1.6 million for Sydney compared to a little over $850,000 for Perth. That being said, Perth prices have been significantly higher in the last few years because of our existing housing crisis, some delays due to COVID, and a lot more other factors. Number second is the weather. So Sydney and Perth lies on two opposite sides of the country. Sydney is on the east coast of Australia, whereas Perth is the capital of Western Australia and lies on the west coast. The two cities are more than 4,000 kilometers apart, so have a very different weather. Summers in Perth are a lot more dry and it can reach up to as high as 45 degrees, whereas Sydney, the temperatures are still fairly mild with an average of about 25 to 35 degrees. Winters, Perth is a lot more wetter compared to Sydney. It rains pretty much every other day during winters, which is the season from June to August. The best part about the Perth weather is it's the sunniest of the capital cities in Australia, where we get about 8 hours of average sunshine almost throughout the year. Number three is the beaches. So beaches in both Sydney and Perth are absolutely beautiful and you cannot go wrong by picking either of the cities. The most common and the world famous beaches in Sydney are Manly and Bondi, whereas here in Perth it's Cottesloe and Scarborough. One major difference though in terms of beaches in both the cities is the crowds. If it's a good and beautiful day, Sydney beaches can be crammed with people, which can be a bit of an unpleasant experience for some people. Whereas in Perth, regardless of what the weather looks like, the beaches are almost never too crowded, so you can enjoy, surf, swim, and make some pleasant memories. Number four is the tolls. So this for me was pretty much the biggest difference, or you would say a pleasant surprise when I moved from Sydney to Perth. Sydney has some of the highest tolls in the country, whereas in Perth, or rather in the entire Western Australia, the tolls are zero. There are absolutely no tolls in the entire state, which is absolutely amazing. On the other hand, in Sydney, a recent article also mentioned that in the next few decades, people or the motorist can actually pay as much as $200 billion worth of tolls. Number five, size and population. Sydney is Australia's largest city in terms of population, which has a little over 5 million people, whereas Perth is the fourth largest with just a little over 2 million people. Number six is location and isolation. So Sydney, as I mentioned earlier, lies on the east coast of Australia, so there are frequent flights to Melbourne, Queensland and Tasmania. Whereas from Perth, the closest city would be Adelaide, which is also a little over 3,000 kilometers. So to go anywhere interstate from Perth, you should really have some time at hand, whereas things are a lot more accessible in the east coast from Sydney. Number seven is the people. This is my own personal experience and not necessarily facts, but I have found the people in Perth are a lot more friendlier compared to the people in Sydney. I think the reason behind this could be the culture here in Perth is a lot more relaxed and laid back compared to a little bit more rushed situation in Sydney. If you go visit a shop here in Perth, there is a high chance that the owners will always greet you and ask you how you are and how your day was, which is not necessarily true if you go out in Sydney. Number eight is food and entertainment. So this shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone, but Sydney's food scene is a lot bigger than Perth. And it's also a lot more diverse, culturally and cuisine-wise. That being said, Perth's food and cafe culture has significantly grown in the last few years, and now you can find food from all around the world in Perth, be it brunches, Indian food, Italian food, modern Australian food, Chinese, Thai, French, most cuisines you'll find in Perth, and they are primarily pretty good. I'll leave a playlist up here if you want to check some of my Perth food recommendations. Now, in terms of entertainment, there isn't much of a nightlife or party culture here in Perth compared to Sydney, where there are a lot more nightclubs and fun activities to do in the later half of the day. You also got to remember that in terms of international artists and concerts, they usually prefer the East Coast, like big cities of Sydney and Melbourne, compared to Perth. So there are a lot more international concerts and shows happening in Sydney than Perth at any given time. Now, if you have enjoyed this video and understood what the difference between the two cities look like, I highly recommend you deep dive into the lifestyle of Perth with this video up next, where I discussed the pros and cons of life in Perth.